With a goal to raise awareness about big tech's impact on journalism, two longtime congressional reporters have teamed up in the effort to protect the field with their initiative called the Save Journalism Project.
So according to their stats, 2,400 journalists have lost their jobs this year alone, and in the last 15 years, 1,300 communities have lost local news coverage. That is unbelievable. Also, 60% of U.S. counties do not even have a daily newspaper. Joining us to explain the significance of those statistics and to give an assessment of the impact of tech on journalism is the co-founder of the Save Journalism Project, John Stanton. He's a longtime congressional correspondent, former bureau chief of BuzzFeed News here in Washington, longtime friend of mine. Great to see you, sir.
It's good to see you.
What's the goal with the project? What are you doing here?
Well, I mean, basically we are hoping to stop more layoffs of journalists. I got laid off in January. Laura got laid off the day before I did, I guess. And it's, the biggest problem we're seeing really is in local communities. Like the Times-Picayune, for instance, which is one of the oldest newspapers in the country, is a local newspaper where I live now in New Orleans, is shutting down at the end of the month. They're not going to publish anymore. The entire staff got laid off.
I didn't realize that.
Right. Yeah, and without those people, people sometimes forget that the reason that you know about all the bad things that are going on in your community, or the fact that the restaurant down the street is serving rat meat or whatever, is because there are journalists around asking questions. And without them around, and without us being able to do our job, it's a very dangerous world, frankly. So.
Well, there's a lot, and the real question is what can we do about it? Because there's quite a bit of evidence that Craigslist actually killed journalism long before Facebook and everybody else came in for the scraps, right? And so, I mean, classified things on the internet are not going away. That's ultimately what sustained local journalism. So what is the view as to how this problem can be solved?
Well, I think we didn't learn the lesson from 2000 when Craigslist came along.
Right.
They did kill off the classified ads, which is what held most newspapers afloat. And then we kind of rebounded as an industry, and we started doing online advertising and things like that, and that worked pretty well for a while. But now you see Google and Facebook and Apple, they control so much of the ability to get your information out there, to get your stories out, and then they control so much of the ad revenue coming back in that it's crippling the industry again. So today there was a new report, a study that came out that shows that last year Google took in $4.7 billion in ad revenue from news outlets. Well, the news outlets themselves, from all of their total online advertising, made $5 billion. So they're taking half.
I think the problem we're going to have to solve is there is no more efficient way, if you're an advertiser, than to go to Google, right? It's targeted advertising, literally of what you're typing in. It is the ultimate market solution to the advertising problem. And so the question is how do you structure journalism in the future? Is an ad-based model even sustainable to keep journalists working today?
I think an ad-based model is going to be the only way to make it sustainable long term. I think the biggest problem is that so long as we have these sort of monopolistic companies that control all ends of the advertising, whether it's how the advertiser starts doing their work, collection of the data, and then paying to have placed on a certain site, they control all of those pieces of the pie, and so that's what I think is really hurting us right now is the monopolies.
Talk specifically about BuzzFeed. I mean, what happened there that led to this round of layoffs?
I mean, I think what happened was they, despite the fact that BuzzFeed was having more page views every month than they thought they were going to, like it was becoming a bigger and bigger site. We had gotten multiple Pulitzer nominations, Pulitzer award-winning reporters there. We weren't making enough money, and they fell short.
The thing that is so interesting to me about BuzzFeed in particular is this is the place that had supposedly cracked the code, right? Really understood the new landscape, had this model that combined serious journalism with this sort of clickable lists and stuff, and it really, really worked up to a point. And so I think that's partly why when people saw the layoffs there, it really shook them, because they thought, well, if BuzzFeed can't figure out how to make this thing really work, who can?
Yeah, well, I think that there was, when I first started there in 2012, the primary revenue was coming from BuzzFeed's own advertising side, right? They were basically writing your ads for you. You would go to them, and they would help create viral advertisements for your company. And that was a short-term kind of bubble of revenue that BuzzFeed got, that Vice did similar kinds of things, that I guess called native advertising content, right?
Yeah.
And that worked pretty well for a very short period of time, but that was never going to be a long-term solution. Because most advertisement was still being controlled by Google and by Facebook. And they eventually regained all the control of all of that.
But is it Facebook and Google's fault that BuzzFeed and Vice, these guys took were awash in venture capital money. They hired all these people.
Yeah.
They went all in on saying, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that there's not that many cents to be made on a click per advertising model. And I think that, look, I mean, I am so sympathetic. I think the death of local journalism is particularly bad. But is it right to conflate, the rise of these huge companies, Mike.com, BuzzFeed, Vice, which irresponsibly took a lot of money and then had to fire people, which is terrible for journalism, to conflate that with local journalism?
Yeah, no, I think it's actually the same thing. I do.
Okay.
I think if you look at what's going on within the industry, you look at the national side. I mean, Gannett has had huge layoffs.
Yes.
Large sort of local newspapers that are actually much bigger than that, like the Cleveland Plain Dealers, had huge amounts of layoffs and buyouts recently, and that they were taking money from advertising too. I don't think that you can separate the two pieces out ultimately. And I think that if you look at, for instance, Facebook's effect on local news, it's huge, right? Because they are driving the eyes to content, right? And then increasingly, especially in the last few years, that has been going to sites that are not necessarily particularly reputable, and it has been crippling the ability of local news to begin capitalizing off of the internet, which I think has been a big problem.
Yeah.
So what is your focus in this project? Are you raising awareness? Are you lobbying? What are you up to?
We're not lobbying. We're trying to raise awareness. And I think one of the big things we're trying to do now is to get other reporters and journalists to begin talking about this. We don't like to talk about ourselves and the things that are affecting our industry because it gets to feeling a bit like advocacy, and we don't like talking about the business side of what we do, especially because of the separation of church and state, sort of idea that we have, which I think has served us very well as an industry for a really long time. But when our industry is now facing a really sort of upfront crisis in terms of our ability to sustain ourselves long term, it's, I think, incumbent on journalists to start talking about what's happening to us. And so I think that's what we're hoping to do.
And how do Trump's constant, persistent attacks on the press make your job harder here?
Well, I mean, it definitely makes it harder because people are less sympathetic. They look at us and they say, well, everybody is fake news. We don't know who to trust, so why should we care that you're losing your job?
I mean, I think in the round of layoffs that you were part of, there was this whole, well, go learn to code, very snide rejoinder, right, of basically well, good luck with your life.
Yeah, there was a lot of that. There was a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of just sort of terrible stuff.
Well, I think it's terrible, but I mean, let's remember. I mean, I will play the devil's advocate here. Is that a lot of those people wrote the same stories about how Appalachian coal miners should go and learn to code, and so it felt like there was a real vindication of a market force coming for many of the people who sneered at many of the people who voted for President Trump. So I understand. I don't think it's a good thing, but I'm just saying I think Twitter coming to the defense of an aggrieved journalist is ridiculous, because I think
hearing anyone losing their job is
it's bad. You're a bad person.
But also, there was actually a bit of a meme that never really existed. There were a few people, a few columnists maybe, who did that, but it was actually most of the stories that were ever written about what was going on in Appalachia have always been pretty sympathetic. I think most reporters that have ever written about it go there and they're like, this is really terrible what's happening to people here. But I think that, because of a few sneering people, we all got tarred with that. But
it's bad.
Most journalists definitely weren't telling coal miners to go learn how to code.
But I think the key point you made is the separation of church and state between journalism and business. I think it was a flawed model. It evolved only after the 1950s with the idea that we all need one paper where Macy's and all these other people can put their coupon cards that housewives can cut out. That's dead. And it should be dead, because we're living in a new age, and if you don't understand how the business of which you are working for doesn't make money, then there's no real how are you supposed to work in this industry? And that's why I'm really curious. I want to know, what is the future models that you guys are looking at? Because that's the question that we have to solve.
Yeah, and I think, look, I'm not an economist, so I definitely am not going to be the one that's going to come up with the answer necessarily. I do think that it's going to have to be a much more collaborative process between management and the workers. I think it's going to have to probably, at least in the short term, certainly have to be based on advertising. I think that's just sort of the way things are right now. I don't. Everybody who's ever worked in the media has worked for somebody that is shady, right? I don't care if it's Jeff Bezos or if it's the families that own, other newspapers or News Corp or whatever, right? Everybody's sketchy, right? They got some agenda they want. And so we always have this tension of fighting that, right? but we need to be much more aware of what they are doing with our money, right? The money that we're trying to make and we're making for them. Because if we're not, you end up in a situation where they become entrenched, they do the same kind of things, just like what happened in 2000 when they didn't want to deal with Craigslist, and next thing you know, everybody was losing their jobs, and now we're having the same thing happen again because we didn't learn the lessons.
Interesting stuff. Congratulations on the project. Come back and tell us how it's going.
Please.
Great to see you. Coming up, as the country continues debating the legal merits of Roe versus Wade, more than 40 elected prosecutors across the country have vowed to uphold the Supreme Court decision.
So the director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion explains why the labels of pro-choice or pro-life don't cut it anymore when Rising continues.